When we talk about why men hurt the women who love them, we have to start by confronting a truth that many people are uncomfortable acknowledging. At the heart of much of this pain is the need for power and control. It's not romantic, it's not complicated, and it's certainly not love, even though it's often wrapped up in the language of affection and intimacy. When someone seeks to control another person, it's because, deep down, they feel out of control themselves. They feel powerless in some area of their own life, powerless over their emotions, powerless over their environment, powerless over their own sense of self-worth, and instead of turning inward to confront those feelings, they look outward. They seek to dominate someone else, to manipulate the emotions, the actions, even the identity of the very person who loves them. Now, this can be confusing because, on the surface, a man who hurts a woman emotionally, verbally, or even physically may not look like a monster. He may look like a partner who is simply passionate, insecure, struggling, and while those labels might have some truth, they can also dangerously minimize the reality of what's happening, domination disguised as love. Control is addictive. Once someone realizes that they can assert control over another human being, that they can, through words, through behavior, through silence, even through physical force, change how someone else feels, how someone else acts, it creates a feedback loop. A dangerous one. It reinforces the illusion that the more they control, the safer they are, the stronger they are, the more loved they are. But that's not love. That's fear masquerading as intimacy. And here's where it gets even darker. Some men believe, consciously or unconsciously, that being loved means being obeyed. That if someone really loves them, they will allow themselves to be controlled, their opinions softened, their dreams dimmed, their independence surrendered. They redefine love as compliance, and if that compliance isn't given freely, it is demanded or coerced or taken by force. But think about what's really happening here. It's not that these men are too passionate or too emotional. It's that they see relationships not as partnerships, but as battlegrounds, places where they must win, where they must dominate, where being vulnerable, truly vulnerable, would be too terrifying. Because vulnerability would mean letting someone else in without guarantees, without control, without the ability to dictate the outcome. And that is simply too threatening for someone whose self-esteem is built on a shaky, hollow foundation. Control offers the illusion of safety. It says, if I can make you act the way I need you to, I won't have to face my fear of abandonment. I won't have to face my fear of being unworthy. I won't have to feel small or helpless or broken. But that safety comes at the cost of the other person's dignity, autonomy, and often their emotional and physical well-being. There's a philosophical cruelty to this dynamic that's important to name. In choosing control over connection, these men destroy the very thing they crave most: love. True love requires freedom. It requires seeing the other person not as an extension of yourself, not as a mirror to validate your worth, but as a sovereign being. Someone whose love is meaningful because it is given freely. You cannot force devotion and call it love. You cannot demand loyalty and call it connection. Real intimacy, the kind that actually heals and sustains, thrives on freedom, not fear. The tragedy is that many women in these relationships spend months, years, even decades trying to love harder. To fix the dynamic, they believe that if they can just be more understanding, more patient, less difficult, they can bring out the good in their partner. And while it's beautiful to want to see the best in someone, it's devastating when that hope is weaponized against them. Because no amount of love can cure a man who uses control to soothe his own wounds. That healing has to come from within him, and many aren't ready to do that work. So when we ask why men hurt the women who love them, we have to look beyond the surface explanations, the stress, the jealousy, the bad childhoods. These things may be real, but they are not excuses. At its core, the pain stems from a failure or a refusal to see love as an act of freedom rather than ownership. The only antidote to this dynamic is radical accountability from individuals, from communities, and from our culture at large. We must stop romanticizing control. We must stop confusing intensity with intimacy. And most of all, we must teach, show, and expect that love, real love, is never about power. It is about partnership. It is about the courage to love without chains. Because in the end, the truth is simple. The more you seek to control someone you love, the less love you actually have. Would you also like me to help you with the next key point to keep the flow seamless across your full speech? When we begin to understand the deeper layers behind why men hurt the women who love them, we can't ignore the role of cultural conditioning, particularly the way toxic masculinity has shaped what it means to be a man. From the time they are boys, many men are taught not always through words, but through behaviors, expectations, and unspoken rules that to be a man is to be powerful, unemotional, dominant. They're taught that vulnerability is weakness, that asking for help is failure, that needing connection, softness, emotional support, the very things that form the backbone of healthy relationships, makes them less worthy in the eyes of the world. Think about what happens to a boy when every time he cries, he's told to man up. When every time he shows sensitivity, he's mocked. When every time he's afraid, he's told fear is shameful. Slowly, systematically, he learns that his emotional self, his authentic self, is not acceptable. He learns that love must be earned through strength, through dominance, through control, not through tenderness, not through emotional honesty. This conditioning doesn't just harm the boy, it harms everyone he will try to love later in life, because he hasn't been taught how to express vulnerability. He expresses fear as anger. Because he hasn't been taught how to manage insecurity, he masks it with control. Because he hasn't been taught that emotional connection is safe, he experiences intimacy as a threat, something that exposes him rather than empowers him. The result, relationships become battlegrounds where control is mistaken for love and emotional detachment is mistaken for strength. Instead of partners, women become opponents' challenges to be subdued, proven wrong, or punished when they do not comply. And here's the real tragedy. The man who lives under the weight of these toxic lessons is often suffering silently. He's lonely, he's isolated, he desperately wants connection, but has no idea how to ask for it. His entire sense of self-worth is built on an outdated, rigid model of manhood that doesn't allow for true love to exist. Because true love demands vulnerability, the very thing he has been taught to fear and avoid at all costs. When we hear about men who belittle their partners, who criticize their emotions, who retreat into silence when conversations get too real, or who erupt into anger when they feel powerless, we're seeing the consequence of this cultural training. We're seeing a human being trapped by an identity that tells him, you must never let anyone see you bleed. And if no one can see you bleed, no one can truly see you. No one can truly know you, which means no one can truly love you. And so, the men trapped in this cycle hurt the very people they love most, not always because they want to, but because it's the only language of connection they've been taught. They push away the people they love because closeness feels dangerous. They criticize because acceptance feels foreign. They dominate because cooperation feels vulnerable. But understanding this doesn't mean excusing it. It doesn't mean women should stay in relationships hoping that love can heal what a lifetime of cultural indoctrination has broken. Compassion does not mean tolerance for abuse. Understanding why a man acts destructively is not the same as justifying it. It's simply a necessary step towards seeing the bigger picture and deciding, with clarity and courage, what to do about it. If we are ever going to shift this dynamic, it has to start with reimagining what strength really looks like. Strength is not domination. Strength is not silence. Strength is not stoic suffering. True strength is emotional courage. It's the willingness to be seen, to be wrong, to be hurt, and to love anyway. We must teach boys and remind grown men that it is far braver to open your heart than to armor it, that asking for help is an act of strength, not failure, that control is not love and domination is not devotion, that partnership, not power, is what turns attraction into lasting connection. And for women, for anyone who loves the work, is in recognizing when a man is still living in the prison of toxic masculinity and understanding that it is not your job to unlock that cell, it's his. Only he can choose to step into the light of a different way of being. The world does not need more men who are tough, silent, and untouchable. The world needs more men who are brave enough to be fully human, messy, emotional, vulnerable, and capable of giving and receiving love without fear. Because in the end, the lesson is simple but urgent. If we teach men that power is love, they will seek to conquer the very people they are meant to cherish. But if we teach men that vulnerability is strength, they will finally be free to love and to be loved in return. If we're going to understand why men sometimes hurt the women who love them, we have to dig into something even more subtle, but just as powerful as control and cultural conditioning: the fear of vulnerability and intimacy. It's almost counterintuitive. We think of love, of being loved, as the most natural human need. We assume that if someone finds a person who genuinely cares for them, nurtures them, chooses them, they would naturally move toward that love, embrace it, protect it. But what many people don't realize, what many women experience painfully firsthand, is that love, real love, can actually terrify someone who has never learned to feel safe being fully seen. Because here's the truth: intimacy is not just about physical closeness. Intimacy is about exposure. It's about letting another human being see you, flaws and all. It's about standing there without the armor, without the bravado, without the rehearsed identity, without the survival mask, and allowing someone to know your fears, your doubts, your unedited heart. For a man who has built his entire emotional survival strategy on being untouchable, this level of openness feels less like a blessing and more like a threat. And so, paradoxically, when love gets close enough to truly touch, the real man underneath the performance, not the public image, not the strong exterior, but the wounded, imperfect human, the instinct for many is not to lean in, but to pull away. Or worse, to push the source of that love away, sometimes with distance, sometimes with anger, sometimes, tragically, with cruelty. Because if I let you in, you might see something I've spent my entire life trying to hide. If I let you love me, you might also leave me. If I open up, I become vulnerable, and if I become vulnerable, I can be hurt. That math, that emotional calculation terrifies people who have learned to associate vulnerability with pain. And in many ways, hurting the woman who loves him becomes a warped form of self-protection. Better to create distance first, better to sabotage intimacy on his terms than to risk being abandoned, betrayed, or judged later. Of course, none of this usually happens consciously. Most men don't wake up one morning and think, "Today, I'm going to destroy the best thing that's ever happened to me." The mind is far more cunning than that. It whispers more subtle lies. She's too good for you. She'll leave eventually anyway. You can't trust her. You're better off keeping your distance. And so instead of leaning into the relationship, he withdraws emotionally. He criticizes, he acts out, he picks fights over trivial things, he tests her love over and over to see if she'll give up on him, sometimes even hoping she will, so he won't have to face the risk of real, enduring intimacy. And the irony, of course, is brutal. In trying to protect himself from potential pain, he creates exactly the suffering he feared. loneliness, isolation, loss. Now, none of this is an excuse. Fear is human, but it is not a justification for hurting others. It is simply a map, a way of understanding how so many relationships that start with tenderness can spiral into confusion and heartache. The challenge for men and for anyone who struggles with vulnerability is learning that the price of real love is the willingness to be hurt. There is no way to experience the full depth of intimacy without exposing yourself to the risk that the person you love might not handle your heart perfectly. There is no guarantee that love won't end or change or disappoint you at times. But the alternative, living behind walls so thick no one can ever truly reach you, is a far more devastating kind of loneliness. The work, then, is learning that vulnerability is not the enemy. Vulnerability is the bridge. It's the doorway through which real connection walks in. And yes, it demands courage, immense courage, to stand there, open-hearted, knowing you might get hurt and choosing to love anyway. It is also understanding that love is not just something you receive. It's something you participate in. It's not enough to want to be loved. You must be willing to be known, fully, without guarantees, without rehearsals, without the safety net of control. And for the women, for anyone loving someone terrified of intimacy, the hardest and most painful truth to accept is this: you cannot love someone into emotional courage. You cannot be kind enough, patient enough, perfect enough to make someone ready to be vulnerable if they have decided, consciously or unconsciously, that they will not take that risk. That decision must come from within them. The greatest act of love you can offer for yourself and for them is to stand in your own truth, to refuse to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's fear, to model what emotional bravery looks like, and to know that you deserve not just love offered in moments of safety, but love that endures through vulnerability. Because at the end of the day, if a man is too afraid to let himself be loved, it is not a reflection of your worth. It is a reflection of his wounds, and the longer we excuse fear as fate, the longer we allow the cycle to continue. Real intimacy asks something simple but revolutionary. Choose love even when it's scary. Choose openness even when it hurts, because the risk of vulnerability is real. But the reward, a love that sees you, knows you, and chooses you anyway, is worth everything. As we peel back more layers of why men hurt the women who love them, there's another uncomfortable truth we have to face. Power struggles and control issues aren't just accidents that happen in relationships. They are often the foundation some relationships are built on from the very beginning. When someone feels deeply insecure inside, when they carry wounds of inadequacy, failure, or not enoughness, one of the most immediate and deceptive ways to soothe that insecurity is through control. Because control offers the illusion of certainty. It says, if I can dictate how you behave, how you feel, what you say, I can finally feel safe. And yet, as we know, control and love are incompatible at their core. Love requires trust. Control demands compliance. Love invites. Control insists. For a man who feels powerless internally, controlling the woman who loves him can seem like a shortcut to emotional stability. If he can control her opinions, her movements, her world even subtly, he can avoid confronting the parts of himself that feel chaotic, broken, or small. He doesn't have to wrestle with the voice inside that says, "You are not enough." Because he's engineered his external world to constantly reassure him that he is in charge, and often it doesn't start in obvious ways. It starts small, a critical comment about what she's wearing, a guilt trip when she spends time with friends, a joke that cuts a little too deep about her ambitions, her dreams, an eye roll when she expresses an opinion that differs from his. Each small act isn't devastating on its own, but together they form an ecosystem of control, a relationship where the woman is slowly trained to question herself, to shrink, to doubt her instincts, to seek approval instead of partnership. the more insecure he feels inside, the more he needs to control outside. And ironically, the more control he exerts, the less love he actually receives. Because love can't breathe in an environment of fear and manipulation. Real connection can only happen between two people who feel safe enough to be themselves without fear of being punished for it. Now, psychologically, this all ties back to a fundamental human paradox. The more we try to control others, the more out of control we actually feel, because deep down, no one can truly control another person's mind, heart, or spirit. You can manipulate behavior for a time, you can coerce compliance temporarily, but you cannot manufacture genuine love. You cannot demand authentic intimacy, and every man who tries to control the woman who loves him is living in that paradox. He thinks that by dominating her, he will finally find peace, but all he finds is deeper loneliness, greater resentment, and a widening gap between himself and the connection he craves. The tragedy is, most of the time, he doesn't even recognize what he's doing. He doesn't see his need for control as a wound crying out for healing. He sees it as protection, as survival, even as love itself. I just care about you. That's why I get upset when you go out without telling me. I'm just trying to help you be your best. If you really loved me, you would do this for me. The language of control is so often disguised as care, as concern, as devotion. And if you're not paying attention, it's easy to mistake control for love, especially when your heart desperately wants to believe it's love. But love does not silence you, love does not shrink you, love does not demand you abandon yourself to keep the peace. Control operates from fear, fear of abandonment, fear of inadequacy, fear of vulnerability. Love operates from trust, trust in the other, trust in yourself, trust in the relationship's resilience. And here's the hardest part. You can't teach someone to trust through your obedience. You cannot love someone hard enough that they suddenly stop needing control. Because the fear they're trying to manage isn't about you, it's about them. It's their internal war, and until they choose to confront it, they will continue to seek external ways to manage it. If you find yourself trapped in a cycle of having to prove your loyalty, to shrink your voice, to sacrifice your freedom in the name of keeping him calm, or keeping the relationship together, I want you to hear me clearly. That is not love. That is captivity, and no matter how much you give, it will never be enough to heal someone else's fear if they are determined to feed it instead of face it. The most radical, life-changing act you can make in this situation is to refuse to betray yourself. To recognize that love without freedom is not love, it's control, and to know deep in your bones that you deserve a love that celebrates your voice, not one that demands your silence. Because here's the final truth. In relationships built on control, both people lose. One loses their freedom, the other loses the chance to ever truly be loved for who they are. Real love doesn't demand that you become smaller to be worthy of staying. Real love says, come as you are and let's build something powerful together.